Have you ever heard a story that felt like a warning from history, too eerie to forget, yet too human to dismiss? This is one of those stories, not a parable, not a fable, a real, historical account lost between pages of competing memories, whispered about by scholars, distorted by centuries of interpretation, and buried beneath layers of silence. This is the story of three Jewish tribes once flourishing in the sun-scorched deserts of Arabia, who vanished from history almost overnight, not because of natural disaster, but because of something far more complex and more human: faith, politics, power, and fear. Let's rewind 1,400 years to a world before oil wealth, before kingdoms, before flags and borders. Arabia was a harsh land, stitched together by fragile alliances and older-than-time blood feuds. In the western part of this land, tucked into an oasis surrounded by lifeless desert, was Yathrib, later known as Medina. It was a place where Jewish farmers once cultivated dates, where tribes fought over honor and survival, and where peace was a temporary illusion. Here, Jewish tribes like Banu Qurayza, Banu Nader, and Banu Qurayza had lived for generations. They weren't strangers. They were rooted in the land as craftsmen, landowners, warriors. Their monotheism wasn't odd. It was respected, even admired. They had influence, alliances with neighboring Arab tribes, and something else, status. But something was coming that would upend everything. You see, influence is a fragile thing. It lives in perception and dies in transition. And the Jews of Yathrib were about to witness the rise of a new prophet, a man from Mecca, carrying revelations that would echo across continents. But what happens when the truths collide? What happens when belief becomes a battleground? Enter the prophet Muhammad. 200 miles away in Mecca, things were already heating up. This wasn't just any city. It was the religious heart of Arabia, a polytheistic metropolis whose economy was built on pilgrims, coming to worship their many gods at the Kaaba, the black stone shrine that even today, Muslims turn toward in prayer. And then came Muhammad, a man with no army, no title, just a reputation for honesty and a message that shook the city's foundations. There is no God but one, and that God demands justice, equality, and mercy. This wasn't just religious disruption. This was economic sabotage. This was political rebellion. Mecca's elite had no time for spiritual revolutionaries. They tried to kill him, flight to Yathrib, but fate, or Providence, had other plans. Muhammad fled to Yathrib, the oasis city where tribes were tired of blood feuds and desperate for peace. They invited him not because of faith, but because of his wisdom, his reputation as a mediator. They weren't looking for a prophet. They were looking for a fixer. And so, with that, Muhammad arrived and did something revolutionary. He wrote a constitution, the first social contract in the region, establishing a new kind of unity. It wasn't based on bloodlines or tribe, but on mutual protection and shared fate. It even included the Jewish tribes. They weren't outsiders. They were part of the Pact. For a moment, it seemed like something new had begun. Reflection, story within the story. Let's pause for a second. Imagine being a Jewish leader in Yathrib. You've lived through decades of conflict. You've negotiated with Arab chiefs. You've prayed to a God your people followed into exile, through Egypt, into Canaan, and now into the desert. And here comes this newcomer, speaking of your God, quoting your prophets, preaching your scriptures, and attracting your children. How would you feel? Would you be honored or threatened? Growing tensions for a while. Things held together, but tension is like a fault line, silent until it cracks. Some Jews accepted Muhammad's message, but most didn't. After all, they already had Moses. They already had a covenant. Why would they need another prophet? Muhammad couldn't understand their resistance, and that misunderstanding would soon spiral into something tragic. The breakdown begins. The Banu Qurayza, known as skilled artisans and warriors, were the first to fall out of alignment. Stories circulated. Maybe they broke the pact. Maybe they traded with Muhammad's enemies from Mecca. Maybe a brawl turned deadly. One story tells of a Jewish goldsmith who humiliated a Muslim woman, sparking a deadly retaliation. Was it true? Was it exaggerated? Was it a cover for something larger? We may never know, but the result was undeniable. Siege, surrender, and exile. The Banu Qurayza left behind everything, land, tools, memories, and disappeared into the desert. Just think about that. Families who had lived in the same place for generations were now refugees. Grandparents separated from grandchildren, artisans forced to abandon their trades, children asking, "Why are we leaving?" with no good answer, all because trust had shattered. The Constitution of Medina, this remarkable attempt at coexistence, was cracking. The Banu Nader and the Banu Qurayza watched from the sidelines, surely wondering if their turn was next. And as we'll see in part 2, it was. But before we get there, ask yourself this: can different communities with different beliefs truly live in peace? If trust is lost, history offers no easy answers, only warnings. In part 2, we dive into what happened with the Banu Nader and how a falling stone, real or imagined, may have triggered the end of another tribe's legacy. If this story made you feel something, even discomfort, that's good. We need to remember the uncomfortable truths if we hope to prevent repeating them. Let me know in the comments, do you think this pact was ever built to last? Or was it doomed from the beginning? In part 1, we explored the uneasy alliance between Prophet Muhammad and the Jewish tribes of Yathrib. We witnessed the rise of a fragile pact, the Constitution of Medina, designed to unite a fractured city, and we saw how that alliance began to crumble with the exile of the Banu Qurayza. Now, we turn our attention to the Banu Nader, a tribe of wealth, intellect, and influence. But in a city where politics and prophecy were colliding, influence became a liability. Setting the stage, who were the Banu Nader? The Banu Nader weren't just landowners. They were strategic thinkers. Their fortress homes overlooked fertile lands. Their alliances extended beyond Medina, and their leadership, especially figures like Hayy ibn Akhtab, knew the art of diplomacy and survival. They had wealth, they had memory, they had history, but all of that would be tested by a single stone. The assassination plot incident, it began with a seemingly innocent event. Muhammad came to the Banu Nader, asking for financial help to resolve a blood money dispute, a common practice among allies. The meeting was cordial. Tea may have been poured, pleasantries exchanged, but what happened next depends on who you ask. Some Muslim sources say that Banu Nader secretly plotted to drop a heavy stone on Muhammad's head from a rooftop. Others believe it was a misunderstanding, or even an excuse crafted to justify a political move. Whatever the truth, Muhammad left abruptly, and soon after, he sent word, "You have 10 days to leave the city." Emotional insight. Imagine this moment, picture the panic. You're a father in Banu Nader. Your children play in a courtyard you helped build. You've just stocked your home with a year's worth of dates, and suddenly, you're told to pack up everything and leave. Not in a year, not in a week, but 10 days. You've signed a treaty. You've paid your dues, and now you're being accused of betrayal. Whether or not the plot was real almost doesn't matter. The fear was. Siege and exile, the Banu Nader refused to leave, so Muhammad prepared for siege. But this was no drawn-out war. Their date palms were cut down. Their supply lines were choked. Their resolve, once iron-strong, crumbled under isolation. They surrendered, but instead of death, they were given exile again. Forced into the desert with only what camels could carry, their homes were left behind. Their libraries, their memories, their maps of water wells, all gone. Some historians say they relocated to Khaybar, another oasis north of Medina, but the wound never healed. Real historical parallel story. Integration. Let's zoom out. This isn't the only time in history that exile replaced diplomacy. In 1492, the Jews of Spain faced the same verdict from Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand: convert, leave, or die. In Russia, pogroms pushed families from shtetls into freezing oblivion. In 20th century Germany, we saw the unspeakable result of dehumanization. It's a recurring cycle. A community rises, builds, integrates, then suddenly becomes the other. The Banu Nader were not the first, and they wouldn't be the last. Turning point. Political realignment. With the Banu Nader gone, power in Medina was consolidating. The tribal balance that once kept the city in check was shifting, and while some Muslims celebrated the outcome, others surely worried. If exile happened once, could it happen again? Among those watching closely were the Banu Qurayza, the last major Jewish tribe in Medina. And as we'll explore in part 3, their story doesn't end with exile. It ends with a verdict that still haunts history books to this day. Emotional reflection. The price of fear. So much of what happened in this chapter was driven by fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of loss, fear of becoming irrelevant. But fear is a poor guide when navigating diversity. It turns neighbors into suspects and treaties into paper shields. Could there have been another path? Could this fragile pact between prophet and tribe have survived if trust had outweighed suspicion? We don't know. History doesn't deal in hypotheticals. It just tells us what happened and warns us about what can happen again. As the dust settled over Medina and the homes of Banu Nader stood silent in the sun, one final test remained. The Quraysh of Mecca were planning war, and the Banu Qurayza, the last Jewish tribe in the city, would soon face an impossible choice: stand with the prophet or fall into history's shadow. In part 3, we uncover the siege, the controversial judgment, and the lingering question: was it justice or was it retribution? Stay with me, because the next chapter is where the story stops being a political drama and becomes a moral riddle. Cold open, the quiet before the verdict. The sun set over Medina. The dust of previous conflicts had barely settled. The homes of the Banu Qurayza stood abandoned. The fields of the Banu Nader grew wild. Now, only one Jewish tribe remained in Medina, the Banu Qurayza. They were craftsmen, leather workers, and warriors, and they lived not just on the edges of society. They were part of its foundation. But history has a cruel rhythm, and the next verse was already being written. The Battle of the Trench, the context of paranoia. In 627 CE, the city faced a siege. The Quraysh and their allies, a massive coalition of tribes, came roaring toward Medina, intending to crush Muhammad and his followers once and for all. But the Muslims had prepared. Under the guidance of a Persian convert, they dug a massive trench around the exposed parts of the city. It was a brilliant move, one that surprised the Meccan cavalry and slowed the momentum of war. Still, tension gripped the air like smoke. Inside Medina, whispers spread. What if the Banu Qurayza break their pact? What if they side with the Quraysh? And here's the tragedy. Nobody knew if betrayal had occurred, but the suspicion alone was enough to spark a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Did the Banu Qurayza actually betray the pact? Muslim sources say a man named Hayy ibn Akhtab, the exiled leader of Banu Nader, entered the fortress of Banu Qurayza during the siege and convinced their chief, Qaybay ibn Asad, to break the treaty. But the Qurayza never attacked. They didn't open the gates. They didn't aid the Quraysh. They merely considered their options, while locked inside their walls, surrounded by fear. Still, when the siege ended in Muslim victory, the retribution was swift. The siege of the Banu Qurayza, Muhammad turned his forces toward the last tribe. They surrounded the Qurayza fortress. After 25 days, the tribe surrendered. And then came the decision. Rather than decide the punishment himself, Muhammad left it to an ally, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, a former leader of the Aus tribe and someone with personal history with the Qurayza. Sa'd ruled with brutal finality. All men of fighting age were to be executed. Women and children were enslaved. Estimates vary, but some sources say 600 to 900 men were killed. Emotional reflection. The day the ground swallowed a people, imagine the silence that followed. The streets of Medina, once alive with debate and culture, now echoed with the absence of a people. Their schools, their shops, their songs, all gone in a single decision. Was it justice? Was it war protocol? Or was it something else? Fear metastasized into finality. Historians still argue. Muslim chroniclers describe it as divine judgment. Others, including many modern scholars, say it was political, even personal. The line between theology and power is razor thin, story parallel, Masada and the weight of last stance in Jewish history. There's the tale of Masada, a fortress where Jewish rebels held out against the Romans. When defeat became inevitable, they chose mass suicide over slavery. The Qurayza made no such choice. They surrendered in hope and were met with a sentence that generations would debate. Like Masada, their story became a symbol, not of triumph, but of loss. And in both cases, we're left with the same haunting thought. What if there had been mercy? Why this matters today? A cautionary legacy. This isn't just about 7th century Arabia. This is about now. It's about how suspicion becomes certainty and how certainty can justify anything, even the erasure of a people. When society is built on pacts, on diversity, on coexistence, what happens when fear enters the equation? That's not a historical question. It's a human one. Personal takeaway. What the Qurayza teach us. History is written by victors, but it's preserved by storytellers. And the story of the Banu Qurayza isn't easy to tell. It's messy, complicated, emotional. There are no perfect heroes, and no one walks away clean. But maybe that's the point. Maybe stories like this survive not because they offer moral clarity, but because they warn us what happens when trust breaks down and when fear is allowed to rule. Today, across the world, we still see pacts broken, minorities scapegoated, histories rewritten. This story, this vanished tribe, reminds us that civilization is delicate, and if we don't protect it with courage, dialogue, and empathy, it vanishes, just like they did. Closing words, echo, and legacy. The Constitution of Medina was once a dream, a vision of pluralism in the desert. That dream died not with war, but with suspicion. And in its place, history offers us a choice: repeat it or learn from it. So here's the question I leave you with. What would you have done if you were the last tribe left? Would you trust? Would you flee? Or would you wait and hope history forgets you? Because sometimes the only thing more haunting than betrayal is silence.